Can they do something here? It's Cristiano Ronaldo. Oh, it's a great cross, and it is an equaliser from Varela. USA denied right at the death.
Well, unfortunately, we all remember that goal, the USA getting the tie against Portugal. Perhaps they win that game. Maybe they get a better matchup in the next round. But the big story in that game, the stoppage time. And the ref actually came out and said after the game he added on another minute because Graham Zusi was subbed in, and that's, of course, when Portugal scored. And joining me now is a man who thinks he can explain how stoppage time is awarded. Maybe he's shed some light on that. Nick Watanabe. He's got a PhD from the University of Illinois. My good friend, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You've done some interesting research here on referee bias and how stoppage time is awarded. So how did you come up with this idea initially?
Well, there's actually a whole line of research that looks at referee bias, whether it's giving a red card, a yellow card, awarding a penalty, or extra time. But what happened was I was at a conference and I went to a presentation. I asked what I thought was going to be a simple and stupid question was, how come none of these presentations about extra time have actually looked at the amount of injuries and fouls that are happening within a match? And someone said, who was actually rather high up in our world, said, oh, that's a good idea. Why don't you do that? So pretty soon I found myself back at home, and here I was trying to figure out how to gather the data to go about trying to find out, how many fouls and injuries happen in a match so we can look at whether it affects extra time at the end of the match.
And walk us through really quickly, how did you go about gathering that data?
So myself and another student, we actually went in and we looked at every single instance in every Premier League match over the last 2 seasons. So we were looking at every time there was a foul, injury, substitution, goal scored, free kick taken. Everything was recorded, every single instance. But just for the second half, because we really want to understand the second half as leading into determining that extra time the referee gives, right? So if he says I gave time for Graham Susi's substitution, it's because that happened in the second half, not in the first half.
And you did this for the Premier League, is that correct?
Yes, we did this for every team, for every match, every single instance. The Premier League, it was a daunting data collection that had 2 people sitting a lot of time in front of computers looking at these match data, but we gathered the whole thing and we put it into a large panel data set that allows us to run results to look at how we can understand extra time within soccer.
Before we get to the good stuff, how it's actually worked, we got to also understand some stuff you controlled for in the experiment. So
yes.
The score had to be 2 goals or less differential, right? And also you looked at kind of nationalistic bias.
Yes, so we actually have 2 models, and the first model looks at situations where the goal differential is 2 goals or less, and there are other models, the situation where there's 1 goal or less. So that also includes ties, and there is slight differences in there. We looked at nationalistic bias because it's been theorized, and some research has shown, for example, at international matches that the bias is based on where the composition of the team is and who the referee is. In our case, I think it wasn't really an important factor, and I think that's partly because we see a changing demographic in the Premier League where there are so many international players on all the teams.
And you actually, now to get to that good stuff, you actually did find some pretty significant results.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was fully surprised by the results, but I think it was rather interesting. We see that scoring goals in the second half gives you more time, but actually goals in extra time, so in that extra amount of period will give you even more time. So a referee will give you more time if you score a goal really late in the match. Substitutions obviously had not the most, but was another significant factor, as was injuries. And fouls, right? So it would seem to be that, for example, fouls, there's, a very, small amount of time you can get from a foul, and a foul takes a lot of time for a person to get back up. So it actually makes sense to actually foul people a lot. And then I think the most important thing we see is actually the goal differential. So with the goal differential, it was significant on the 2-goal situation and slightly significant in the 1-goal differential situation, which actually means that home teams were getting more extra time when they needed to score goals and less extra time when they actually needed to defend. So in other words, referees were giving advantageous situations to home teams.
So lots of people love to look, especially in the Premier League, and think Manchester United gets these advantages. They get ridiculous amounts of stoppage time. So what you're saying is when they're at home, maybe that's true, but that's not necessarily true across the board.
That is correct. And we actually controlled with special effects for each referee for every team, both home and for away. And Manchester United was not significant in any model. In fact, most of the teams were not significant at all. So it's not actually that any specific team gets more time, but that the team that's at home will get the better situation. Manchester United, we naturally watch more probably because they're an exciting team. So it actually would make sense that we think they get more time, where across the league we're actually getting more time.
And the other thing I want to go back to really quick is the foul situation, because I think that's really, really interesting. So what you're saying is the U.S. is trying to bird time in this game we saw in the World Cup game by making the sub. But what they actually should have been doing is hacking Portugal every time they got the ball. Is that what your research is saying?
Well, I think there's actually a couple things they could have done. First is hacking Portugal, because a referee from our research adds on maybe 2 or 3 seconds for a foul, where it would take you at least 10, 15 seconds to actually restart. So if you think about it, not any dangerous foul or anything that's going to give them a free kick, but if you can just foul them, around the halfway line, or, send the ball deep, foul them on their other end, the goalie has to run up, kick the ball, try to send it long forward, that's going to take a lot of time, so that helps out. Substitutions are helpful. It's curious that the referee says he gave 1 minute, because our results say that referees tend to give about 30 seconds for a substitution. So he may have watched his watch and saw how long it took Graham Zusi to walk off. I think my own personal opinion, I've told this to you before, is you always substitute the captain unless he's the goalkeeper, because he has to take off the armband, he has to go to someone else, put the armband on, shake somebody's hand, walk off the field, clap to everyone, and then, it's taken 2 minutes, and then the referee might only add on 30 seconds, so you've wasted some time there. So our research does have implications on how you can actually, try to waste that time at the end of a match.
What do you think it would take for real managers to kind of put a strategy in place based off research like this?
I think it would take them to be aware of it. That's often the problem, is that they're not necessarily aware of it. And B is for them to actually find a way that they can coach it into players. And I think that's probably the difficult part, is to be able to translate into players. You want to tell them, foul, we're going to substitute, take your time when you're going to substitute. It doesn't seem very sportsmanlike, but if you consider the difference between Arsenal and Tottenham 2 years ago was 1 point, if Tottenham had gained that 1 point, it would have made $30 million more for them in terms of revenue for their team. I think the coaches can say, hey, it's that single point can actually mean a difference in your salary, right? So it is something that maybe players should be able to see as an incentive, and managers should probably consider as, how do we get out of a match? And obviously, you don't want to say just foul, 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 but there's tactics that you can use to try to do this in a smart manner.
Now, if a league were to use this information, how would, in your opinion, should they use it to make referees more fair than they are right now?
Well, if the league, and often a lot of this research, we talk about monitoring. So the idea is, if we're looking at the Premier League, is they actually need to monitor referees maybe a little bit more. It's not that they're doing a bad job. It's not that they're doing something horrible and they're changing outcomes of lots of matches. But there is a slight bias there, right? It might only be a couple seconds here and there, but that could actually be the difference in getting that point for Tottenham or Arsenal losing one of their points. So we would talk to referees and say, hey, you need to be aware that, home or away, you need to be giving the same amount of time. We want to try to create as much fairness, because that is the idea, is that a home team shouldn't have an advantage in terms of the number of seconds they get at the end of a match.
Right. And the last thing I want to talk to you about, you are doing this research with MLS as well.
Yes, so our next step is we're actually going to look at Major League Soccer, where monitoring of referees is even a newer concept. We know that there's been some significant changes in the league. For example, the penalties taken have pretty much doubled from 1 year to the next. So that's all because of what the league's been telling people. So we're going to try to collect some data and see if there's a bias that's been included within these changes. Like maybe, the league says you got to give more penalties. Well, naturally they give them to the home team, or if they give them more extra time and so forth. So we're going to see if there's changes. We don't know if there's any results yet, but that's our next stage in research.
All right, well, hopefully we'll get to have you back on when you finish up that research, and maybe we can take another look and kind of see where it goes for MLS as well.
Sounds good.
Possible U.S. Open Cup as well?
Yeah, we're actually thinking about the U.S. Open Cup, because it's sort of a natural experiment, because we get to see how a upper division team versus a lower division team, will the team that's naturally favored get the better result, will get the better judgments. We saw a lot of red cards for NASL teams. here in the U.S. Open Cup this year. So I'm sure there's some people out there who would think, there is definitely bias against NASL. The idea is whether we can actually show that within the data or not. So it's not like we're actually saying, oh, we're here to point out that there's bias, but we're just testing to see if there is bias, and if so, in what direction it might exist.
Nick Watanabe joins me. Hopefully he'll be able to join me again. Been a lot of criticism about MLS referees this year. Michael Bradley, the latest on Saturday. So like I said, hopefully we'll get you back on and talk some MLS.
Thanks for having me.